Rain traced silver veins down the courthouse windows, blurring the city into a watercolor of steel and storm. Inside Courtroom 9, the air was colder than it needed to be, as if the room itself had chosen a side. Saraphina Vale Mercer sat alone at the petitioner's table, in a cream silk blouse and a dark skirt so simple it made the diamonds around her look invisible. Her hands were folded over a black leather folder. Her shoulders were straight. Her face was still. Across from her, Adrian Mercer was laughing. Not quietly, not politely, laughing with the full-bodied ease of a man who believed humiliation was a private privilege he could exercise in public. Beside him, Vivian Hart crossed one long leg over the other and hid a smile behind manicured fingers. Victor Halden leaned in, murmured something low, and Adrian laughed harder. Even Evelyn Mercer smiled. "Look at her," Vivian whispered, not quite softly enough. She dressed like a widow to her own relevance. Adrian's mouth curved. That would require her to have had relevance. A few people in the gallery chuckled. A clerk looked down too quickly. Someone in the second row shifted as though discomfort were contagious. Saraphina heard all of it, every syllable, every tiny, polished cruelty. She did not move. That seemed to amuse Adrian even more. He rose before the judge had fully settled in, his cufflinks flashing under the lights. "Your Honor," he said smoothly, "with respect, I hope we can make this efficient. My wife has a talent for silence, but not for substance. She entered this marriage with nothing, and leaves it, regrettably, the same." Vivian let out a soft little laugh that sounded like glass tapping glass. Victor added, "My client has been more than generous. We trust the court will not confuse emotional theatrics with legal entitlement." Seraphina's pulse beat once in her throat, hard, slow, painful. She kept her gaze lowered. That, too, was deliberate. Because silence is very useful when cruel people mistake it for surrender. Judge Helena Ward studied the room over the rim of her glasses. Outside, thunder rolled low over the skyline. Inside, Adrian sat back down with that gleaming expression men wear when they think they have successfully turned a woman into an object. Then Seraphina finally lifted her eyes. Not to the judge, to Adrian. And in a voice so soft it forced the whole courtroom to lean closer, she asked, "Would you like everything placed on the record, Adrian?" His smile only widened. That was his last comfortable moment. Adrian took her question as fear. That was the first layer of cruelty, not merely hurting her, but misreading her pain as weakness. He leaned back in his chair, one ankle on the opposite knee, as though the courtroom were his private club, and everyone inside it had come to watch him choose a vintage. "By all means," he said. "Let's have transparency. It will save time." Vivian smiled at him, with the glistening satisfaction of a woman who thinks proximity to male power is the same thing as having any of her own. She was dressed in pale gold silk, throat iced in diamonds, perfume drifting through the courtroom in a trail of gardenia and ambition. When Seraphina glanced her way, Vivian did not look embarrassed. She looked delighted. Evelyn Mercer adjusted one white pearl earring and sighed as if tragedy had personally inconvenienced her. "Some women," she murmured to no one and everyone, "never learn that elegance cannot be borrowed." Victor Halden stood with the sleek confidence of a man who had destroyed families for billable hours and slept perfectly well after. "Your Honor, my client is prepared to proceed through a full accounting. Mrs. Mercer has implied private contributions to the Mercer estate. We anticipate no evidence supporting that implication." He turned a page. His voice sharpened. "The lake house on Geneva, the Mercer penthouse, Mercer Aurum Hospitality, Mercer Capital Residences, the vehicle portfolio, the post-marital investment accounts, the art acquisitions, the St. Clair Trust distributions. My client asserts sole or family line ownership over all material holdings." He spoke the list like a litany of power. and every item landed on Saraphina like a stone, not because she feared losing them, but because each name carried a memory. The penthouse, where Adrian corrected her wine pronunciation in front of financiers and called it teasing. The lake house, where Evelyn once told her, smiling, "A good wife is heard only when spoken for." The Paris trip that had turned into a secret anniversary for Adrian and Vivian, while Saraphina sat alone at a charity dinner, wearing the necklace he had forgotten he promised to clasp around her throat himself. Humiliation, when repeated often enough, becomes architectural. It builds rooms inside a person. Victor continued. Mrs. Mercer has no executive title, no documented capital introduction, and no contractual basis to suggest ownership or controlling interest in any asset under review. Adrian rose again without being asked, eager now, flushed with the thrill of performing dominance. If we're being brutally honest, Your Honor, Saraphina liked the life. She liked the cars, the galas, the houses, the staff. She liked being Mrs. Adrian Mercer. He glanced at her, the corner of his mouth lifting. She just never understood what it took to create any of it. A low murmur passed through the room. Judge Ward did not interrupt. She was watching. Vivian tilted her head and added, "Some people are decorative. That's not an insult. It's just a category." There it was. Naked, elegant, cruel. A reporter in the back scribbled quickly. One of the younger associates at Victor's table tried to hide a smile and failed. Even the court stenographer paused for half a second, as though the sentence itself had left a stain in the air. Saraphina felt heat gather behind her ribs. It was not shame anymore. Shame had burned out months ago. What remained was something quieter, older, colder. Adrian mistook her stillness for collapse. "You don't need to make this uglier than it already is," he said, voice suddenly mock-gentle. "You were comfortable. You were protected. I gave you a beautiful name and a beautiful life. Not everyone can keep that forever." That one landed, because once, long ago, she had believed him. Believed that his name was a roof. Believed marriage meant shelter. Believed love sounded like certainty. Her fingers tightened once around the edge of the black folder. Vivian noticed, smiled wider. Evelyn leaned forward, pearls glowing at her throat like frozen tears. "My dear, silence can look dignified, but in your case it looks vacant." A few more laughs, low, refined, worse than loud laughter. Saraphina lowered her gaze for exactly 2 seconds, long enough for the room to think it had broken her. Then she raised it again. No tears, no trembling mouth, no plea, only that impossible calm. And that was when the temperature changed, not because anyone else understood it yet, but because Amelia Sloane quietly uncapped her pen, opened the leather portfolio beside Saraphina, and slid the first document into view. The cruelty in the room had reached its peak, which meant the fall could begin. Long before she became Mrs. Adrian Mercer, Saraphina Vale had learned the discipline of disappearing in plain sight. Her grandfather, Lucien Vale, used to say that loud wealth attracts parasites, and quiet wealth studies them. He built Vale Dominion over 4 decades with the sort of patience history books never celebrate, because it leaves no fireworks behind it, only continents rearranged. Ports, luxury hospitality, logistics, rare earth infrastructure, data corridors, art-secured lending, private aviation, silent, polished, global power. He did not raise Saraphina to glitter. He raised her to observe. While other heiresses learned how to enter rooms, Saraphina learned how contracts breathe, how debt decays behind polished annual reports, how vanity projects reveal a weak man faster than confession. At 19, she could read a balance sheet the way a musician reads a score. At 24, she was quietly sitting in strategy rooms under a maiden-name trust structure, no society column ever connected to the Vale Empire. At 28, after Lucien's death, the controlling authority of Vale Dominion passed to her through layered holdings designed specifically to protect the family from exactly the sort of opportunist she would one day marry. No one outside a very small legal circle knew. Saraphina kept it that way on purpose. She wanted one impossible luxury, to be loved without being priced. Then Adrian Mercer arrived, all charm and velvet confidence, carrying flowers, thoughtful questions, and that dangerous talent certain men have for imitating depth when they sense it in a woman. He never asked enough about her family, never pushed hard enough at the blank spaces. She noticed. She forgave him for it, because love is generous at the beginning. It edits, it softens, it interprets absence as mystery rather than neglect. So she stepped into marriage quietly. She wore simpler clothes. Let him assume she came from modest money. Let Evelyn Mercer believe she had married beneath the family tree. Let the world think Seraphina's composure was gratitude rather than discipline. For a while it almost worked. Then she saw the books. Not openly. Adrian never would have permitted that. But carelessness is the disease of arrogant men. He took late-night calls in the penthouse study with the door half open, left leverage memos on the dining table, ranted after board meetings about floating rate exposure and refinancing pressure, as though his wife were elegant wallpaper with no memory.
Saraphina listened. Mercer Aurum hospitality was glittering outside and rotting underneath. Adrian had expanded too fast, borrowed too hard, and stitched the illusion together with leverage. The Geneva Lake house was collateral. The penthouse was leveraged. His vehicle portfolio was leased through a credit chain he no longer properly controlled. The flagship hotel group was protected by debt covenants he barely read because men like Adrian think signatures are beneath them once the pen is in their hand. She warned him once. "Your debt tower is built on weather," she said one evening, standing near the fire while snow climbed the windows. "One bad quarter and the wind gets in." He laughed without looking up from his drink. "You sound adorable when you pretend to understand capital structure." After that, she said no more. Instead, she called Elias Thorne, Vale Dominion's chief restructuring counsel, from a private number hidden under her maiden name trust. She requested quiet acquisition authority over every Mercer note available on secondary exposure. No headlines, no pressure, no public move, just patience. One debt slice at a time, Vale entities began buying the weak bones of Adrian's empire. The resort paper in Zurich, a bridge facility out of Manhattan, 3 layers of mezzanine debt linked to Mercer Capital residences, the art-secured line underwriting his collection, a private lending arm controlling the penthouse. Even the building housing Victor Halden's law firm sat inside a property basket Vale purchased through an infrastructure-linked real estate vehicle Adrian never noticed, because he never imagined anyone patient enough to hide inside the walls. Saraphina did not acquire these things out of spite. Not at first. At first she was saving him, saving the company from implosion, saving the staff from layoffs, saving his mother's social mythology from public collapse, saving the version of Adrian she kept hoping would reappear if disaster ever humbled him. Disaster never humbled him. It fed him. The more she stabilized in silence, the crueler he became in comfort. He mocked her opinions at dinner parties, corrected her in front of bankers whose debt she secretly controlled, traveled with Vivian using company structures Saraphina herself had kept solvent, humiliated her with assets standing only because her invisible hands held them upright. And when he filed for divorce, he made his fatal mistake. He filed declarations listing his empire as separate, secure, uncontested power. He threatened to leave her with a transitional payment and a patronizing silence. He let Victor build an entire legal posture around the fantasy that Saraphina Mercer was a beautiful dependent with nowhere to go. By then, Saraphina was no longer trying to save him. She was preparing the truth. She stepped fully into Vale Dominion under sealed authority, replaced 2 weak trustees, consolidated control, activated dormant voting rights, moved the hospitality division under a new holding line, had Amelia Sloan and Elias Thorne prepare a simple strategy. Let Adrian speak first. Let him name the assets. Let him inflate himself under oath. Then answer him not with anger, with ownership. On the evening before the trial, Saraphina stood alone in the top-floor Vale office, above a city glittering like broken crystal. The windows reflected her back to herself, not as Adrian's wife, not as Evelyn's disappointment, not as Vivian's target, as heir, as architect, as the quiet woman every cruel person in her life had mistaken for empty. When Amelia joined her, she placed a leather portfolio on the desk. "Once he confirms the list," Amelia said, "it all becomes very clean." Saraphina touched the cover and looked out into the rain-dark skyline. "Good," she said softly. clears throat. Let it be clean, because elegance, at its highest level, is not noise, it is precision. And by morning, every polished lie Adrian Mercer had built around himself would begin collapsing in public under the weight of documents signed by his own hand. Back in the courtroom, arrogance spread through Adrian's side of the room like perfume, expensive, sweet, and faintly poisonous. Victor Halden sensed momentum and pressed harder. Your Honor, the longer this takes, the clearer the truth becomes. Mrs. Mercer has offered implication without evidence, posture without standing. He turned just enough to glance at Saraphina. Silence can sometimes be confused with depth. In these matters, it usually means there is nothing to say. Adrian smiled with open satisfaction. Vivian, bored now by mere victory, wanted spectacle. She leaned toward Evelyn and said, "Do you think she'll cry before lunch or after?" Evelyn did not even hide her amusement. If she had any instinct for timing, she would have spared herself this morning entirely. There was something particularly vile about refined people being cruel in a whisper. Judge Ward asked if the petitioner intended to respond to the asset characterization. Amelia Sloane stood only long enough to say, "In due course, Your Honor." Victor actually laughed, softly, sharply. Of course. That tiny laugh emboldened Adrian beyond reason. He rose again, though no one had invited him to. "I think what's happening here is simple. Saraphina built an identity around proximity to my life, my name, my world. And now that the marriage has failed, she is struggling with the obvious truth that access is not ownership." He let those words hover, admiring them. The gallery was still now, not sympathetic, hungry. Adrian continued. "She confuses being present for being relevant. She attended dinners, flew on planes, sat in homes. That does not make them hers." Vivian's smile sharpened. "It made for lovely photographs, though." A couple of people laughed again. One of the younger clerks quickly pressed his lips together when Judge Ward glanced up. Saraphina remained motionless. Rain ticked against the windows. Somewhere far down the hall, a door opened and shut. The whole world seemed to be holding the same pose as she was, waiting. Then Adrian committed the kind of error men commit only when they believe absolutely no consequences can touch them. He began listing the assets again, slowly this time, deliberately, enjoying each word. The Mercer Penthouse, the Geneva House, the Vehicle Collection, Mercer Orem Hospitality, Mercer Capital Residences, the St. Clair accounts, the post-marital acquisitions, the collection. He looked directly at Saraphina. Not hers, never hers. Vivian exhaled a pleased little sigh. Evelyn lowered her eyes as though this public execution bored her by its necessity. Victor placed one palm flat on the table, completely at ease, and across from them, Amelia Sloane turned one page. Just one. The sound was nearly nothing, but Saraphina heard it like the unsheathing of a blade. Judge Ward noticed too. Her eyes settled on Amelia's portfolio for a fraction longer this time. Adrian saw the glance and mistook it for judicial approval. That fed him further. He straightened his tie, looked around the courtroom, and decided to go lower, much lower. And when cruel people decide they have won, that is almost always the precise moment they destroy themselves. Adrian took one slow step away from counsel table and let his gaze rest on Saraphina with the false tenderness of a man polishing a knife before using it. "Your Honor," he said, "I would prefer not to be harsh, but she has forced this." He looked at Saraphina as though he were explaining her to the room. "When I met her, she was quiet, graceful, and grateful. I mistook that for depth. What I eventually learned was simpler. She was quiet because there was very little there." The sentence landed like a slap. Vivian smiled into her hand. Evelyn closed her eyes briefly in satisfaction. Victor did not interrupt. Why would he? Men like him bill extra for silence when a client is destroying someone effectively on his own. Adrian kept going. "She had no pedigree anyone respected, no profession worth naming, no instinct for business, no understanding of consequence. I carried her, financially, socially, intellectually." He gave a tiny shrug. "Perhaps that sounds cruel, but truth often does." For the first time, a visible tension moved through the gallery. Even people who had come for scandal could feel the ugliness curdling now. Saraphina's face did not change. That seemed to infuriate Adrian more than tears would have. He leaned forward, voice softer, more personal, more lethal. "Tell them, Saraphina. Tell them who you were before my name. Tell them what room opens for you after today. You don't belong in boardrooms. You don't belong in houses like ours. Without me, you return to what you always were." He paused. Then he gave the final insult the room would remember for years. "Invisible." The word rang out cleanly. Vivian let out a low laugh. One quick, bright, horrible sound. And because cruelty loves witnesses, Adrian turned slightly so the whole courtroom could hear him. "I'll even be generous, Your Honor. Let her keep the jewelry I gave her. Every discarded queen deserves costume pieces for the memory." That did it. A clerk looked down in shame. Someone in the back whispered, God. Judge Ward's jaw tightened. The rain on the windows seemed louder now, harder, as though the storm itself had leaned in. Saraphina lowered her eyes, not in defeat, in mercy, because if she had looked directly at Adrian in that moment, she might have let him see the last shard of pity leaving her. Instead, she inhaled once, slow and measured. Her fingertips brushed the edge of the black folder. Amelia Sloane rose beside her at exactly the same second, elegant as a blade lifting from velvet. "Your Honor," Amelia said, voice smooth as dark glass. "The petitioner is now prepared to answer every assertion made this morning. We request that Mr. Mercer remain standing." Victor's expression changed, just slightly. Vivian's smile faltered. Adrian turned, annoyed more than afraid. He still thought this was a woman about to plead. He still thought silence had been emptiness. He still did not understand that in rooms like this, the most dangerous person is often the one who has allowed everyone else to speak first. And then Saraphina stood. She rose without hurry. No dramatic movement, no trembling rage, no spectacle. Just a woman unfolding to her full height while the rain silvered the windows behind her, and the room, all at once, seemed to realize it had misjudged the scale of her. Her cream silk caught the grey light. Her face was calm, too calm. The kind of calm that only exists after grief has already burned through everything soft and left only shape. Amelia Sloane took one step forward and placed a set of bound documents before the clerk. "Your Honor," she said, "the petitioner asks that Exhibits 12 through 34 be entered into the record. These include certified trust documents, secured debt assignments, title transfers, lien instruments, board resolutions, and controlling interest certifications." Victor Halden was on his feet at once. "Objection. Ambush. Relevance." Judge Ward did not look at him. She was already reading the top page. "Sit down, Mr. Halden." Victor sat, slowly. Amelia continued. "Before addressing the insults offered this morning as though they were facts, the petitioner wishes to correct the record. Mrs. Mercer appears in this court under the married name Saraphina Vale Mercer. Her premarital legal identity is Saraphina Lucienne Vale, sole beneficiary and acting executive chair of Vale Dominion Holdings." The courtroom did not react at first, not because the words lacked force, because they took time to land. Then a reporter in the back went visibly pale. One of the finance bloggers actually whispered, "No way!" Evelyn Mercer's hand flew to her pearls. Victor stared at Amelia with the stunned disbelief of a man who had just discovered the floor plan beneath him was false. Adrian frowned. "What is this?" Amelia turned a page. "This is the truth, Mr. Mercer." Judge Ward lifted her eyes to Saraphina. "You are the acting executive chair of Vale Dominion Holdings?" Saraphina met her gaze. "Yes, Your Honor." The judge glanced back to the document set. Her expression sharpened. Vale Dominion was not ordinary wealth. It was the sort of private empire that moved behind governments, behind luxury markets, behind polished public boards. Old money, disciplined money, discreet global capital, the kind that did not appear in magazines because it preferred to appear in signatures. Adrian laughed once. Too fast. "That is absurd." Amelia handed a certification to the bailiff, who delivered it to Victor, then Adrian. "Beneficiary confirmation, trustee affirmation, board ratification, international filings attached, every page certified." Adrian scanned the first sheet, then the second. The blood drained from his face with almost artistic speed. Vivian leaned toward him. "Adrian?" He did not answer. Amelia's voice remained perfectly level. "Now to the assets Mr. Mercer so generously identified as his." She turned to the judge. "The Mercer penthouse is held under Park Ellison Private Credit, a debt vehicle acquired by Vale Dominion 18 months ago after covenant breach. Collateral title transferred 32 days ago." A pause. "The Geneva house was pledged against a hospitality refinancing package. That package defaulted. Vale acquired the senior paper 11 months ago. Enforcement completed last quarter." Another pause. "The vehicle collection is leased under a structure controlled by Vale Automotive Finance, itself wholly owned by a Vale Dominion subsidiary." She lifted another document. "The art collection was secured against a bridge line. We hold that line. Inventory control sits with the petitioner." Victor's mouth opened, closed, opened again. "This is impossible." Saraphina looked at him for the first time that day. Not angrily, not triumphantly, just clearly. "No, Mr. Halden, it is documented." A murmur spread through the courtroom like a draft. Adrian set the papers down too hard. "Even if any of this is real, it changes nothing. Vale Dominion has nothing to do with our marriage." Amelia's eyes cooled. "On the contrary, it has everything to do with the representations you made under oath. You claimed exclusive ownership and control over assets whose debt, title, or enforcement rights sit with my client. You threatened her with deprivation using property you do not, in any meaningful legal sense, command." Judge Ward's attention sharpened further. "Is that accurate, Mrs. Vale?" Saraphina's voice came soft, low, and devastatingly steady. "Yes, Your Honor." The room went silent, and then she spoke again. I did not enter this marriage with nothing. I entered it with more than enough to buy every room in which I was later humiliated. No one moved. Not the clerks. Not the lawyers, not even Vivian. Saraphina continued, her words clean and measured, as though grief itself had learned impeccable diction. I concealed my position because I wanted a life unpriced. I wanted to know whether I could be loved before my balance sheet entered the room. I thought privacy would protect the marriage from greed. She looked at Adrian then. Instead, it protected your arrogance. Adrian swallowed hard. You lied. No, she said, clear as throat. I declined to rescue your imagination. A few people in the gallery actually exhaled aloud. Amelia stepped forward again. The petitioner also requests the court review Exhibits 21 through 26, documenting Vale Dominion's acquisition of controlling debt in Mercer Aurum Hospitality and Mercer Capital Residences. Judge Ward leafed through them page by page. Her brows rose. Victor saw it and went pale. Amelia did not stop. Mercer Aurum Hospitality is not only distressed, Your Honor, it is functionally dependent on creditor tolerance. Vale Dominion currently controls the relevant debt instruments, voting triggers, and conversion rights. In simple terms, the empire Mr. Mercer described this morning survives at the pleasure of the woman he has spent hours mocking. A collective sound moved across the courtroom, not quite a gasp, too stunned for that. It was the sound of certainty dying. Adrian shook his head. No, that's Saraphina's calm, never cracked. The Zurich notes, the Manhattan Bridge facility, the mezzanine stack behind St. Clair. I bought all of them after you ignored every warning about leverage. I spent 2 years quietly preventing your collapse. Vivian stared at her now, with something raw and new in her face. Fear. Evelyn stood halfway, clutching the edge of the bench in front of her. My son built that company. Saraphina turned her head with aristocratic slowness. Your son branded it. Staff carried it. Lenders tolerated it. I prevented its funeral. The words fell like cut crystal. Judge Ward rapped the bench once. Order. Victor stood again. But now his confidence had dissolved into something frantic and brittle. Your Honor, we request immediate recess to verify chain of title and— You were given disclosure schedules last week? Amelia said. Victor froze. Amelia looked directly at him. You chose not to read the attachments? The humiliation on his face was almost elegant in its symmetry. Judge Ward's gaze sharpened into ice. Mr. Holden, did you file sworn statements asserting your client held sole or family line control over the penthouse, Geneva residence, investment accounts, hospitality group, and collection? Victor hesitated. That single hesitation said everything. Judge Ward's voice dropped. Answer the question. Yes, Your Honor. And was that filing materially inaccurate? Victor looked at Adrian. Adrian looked at no one. Yes, Victor said at last. The courtroom broke into whispers. The bailiff called for silence. Reporters were already typing. The socialites in the back row had gone from entertained to electrified. Vivian looked suddenly overdressed, like a woman who had mistaken proximity to luxury for safety. Adrian pushed back from the table. This is manipulation. She planned this. That was when Saraphina finally let a little heat enter her voice. I planned survival. She took one measured step forward. You paraded your mistress into court. Another step. You called me decorative, empty, invisible. Another. You told this room I had no understanding of consequence while wearing a life I had kept from collapsing under your vanity. Adrian's face changed. For the first time all morning, he looked small. Judge Ward addressed Saraphina directly. Mrs. Vale, are you stating under oath that the principal assets used by Mr. Mercer to threaten or diminish you are presently subject to your ownership, control, or enforcement rights? Yes, Your Honor. And are you stating that his company remains operational in significant part because of silent intervention through your holdings? Yes. And did he know any of this when he made today's statements? Saraphina's gaze returned to Adrian. No. Judge Ward removed her glasses. That small movement carried the force of a verdict. Then the court has a serious problem. She turned pages with deliberate care. The prenuptial agreement excludes independently held premarital trust structures and all income derived therefrom absent express commingling. If Vale Dominion was yours before marriage, and if the relevant control sits through those protected structures, then Mr. Mercer spent this morning threatening a woman with assets he neither clearly owns nor can credibly use against her. There it was. The legal spine broken cleanly in public. Evelyn sat down as though something inside her knees had given way. Vivian glanced toward the door. Victor looked sick. Adrian looked as though he had been forced to hear a language in which he was suddenly illiterate. Amelia raised one final folder. Your Honor, there is one more matter. The law offices of Halden, Price, and Rowe currently occupy 3 floors in Marston Tower under a line of credit recently assumed by Vale Commercial Estate. Rent relief expired this morning at 8 a.m. Victor blinked. What? Saraphina did not even look at him. Amelia added, meaning, among other things, that opposing counsel has spent the morning mocking my client inside a building she now effectively controls through secured enforcement rights. A sound like collective disbelief ran through the room. Even Judge Ward seemed briefly taken aback. Adrian whispered, Jesus. Seraphina's face remained serene. This was not revenge in the vulgar sense. No shouting, no theatrical breakdown, no wild triumph. Just truth, unveiled with the severe elegance of a blade withdrawing from velvet. Judge Ward straightened. Effective immediately, all prior asset representations made by Mr. Mercer are stricken pending forensic review. Temporary injunctive relief is granted. Mr. Mercer is prohibited from transferring, liquidating, or publicly misrepresenting any property or entity subject to Vale Dominion control until this court completes valuation and compliance review. She looked directly at Adrian. And given what I have heard today, I am considering sanctions for materially false disclosure, reputational abuse in pleadings, and misuse of judicial process. Adrian opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Judge Ward was not done. Mr. Mercer, you may also wish to confirm who owns your residence before deciding where to return this evening. That line shattered whatever dignity he had left. The gallery erupted in whispers. Vivian stood abruptly, chair scraping hard against the floor. She stared at Adrian, as if seeing him clearly for the first time. Not as a prize, not as a ladder, but as a collapsing facade in an expensive suit. She picked up her handbag and walked out without a word. He flinched at the sound of the door closing behind her. Evelyn's lips moved, but no sound emerged. Victor stared down at his own hands, as though wondering when they had become so unreliable. And Saraphina? Saraphina simply gathered her folder. She had not raised her voice, had not begged, had not wept for the room that once fed on her humiliation. She turned toward Adrian one final time. He looked at her now with naked astonishment and something worse than fear. Recognition. Recognition of what he had done, of whom he had done it to, of the scale of the quiet he had mocked. Seraphina, just her name, nothing else. She paused. Then, in a voice soft enough to make everyone listen harder, she said, "You were right about one thing, Adrian." His throat moved. "I should leave this marriage with exactly what was mine before it." Her eyes held his for one suspended second. Then she finished. Everything. And in the silence that followed, even the rain seemed to stop and listen. Collapse did not come to Adrian Mercer all at once. That would have been mercy. It came in elegant stages. By evening, the courtroom footage had already begun circulating in whispered clips and breathless summaries across legal circles, financial blogs, and private group chats where old money pretends not to gossip while doing almost nothing else. By dawn, the story had sharpened into something far more lethal than scandal. It had become a cautionary tale. The husband who mocked his quiet ex-wife in court. The quiet ex-wife who turned out to own the debt beneath his empire. The mistress who arrived dressed for victory and left before the hearing even ended. The lawyer who never read the attachments. Markets love blood when it wears cufflinks. Mercer Courtroom, hospitality called an emergency board session before sunrise. Adrian arrived furious, exhausted, and still foolish enough to imagine he could command the room through tone. But tone is worthless once power has migrated elsewhere. 3 directors had already spoken to Vale Dominion's restructuring team. 2 lenders had joined by secure line. The general counsel would not meet Adrian's eyes. He was informed, with exquisite civility, that his signing authority had been suspended pending review. He was told board oversight was transitioning under creditor pressure. He was asked to surrender access credentials to several internal systems. The silence after that request was longer than any silence Seraphina had endured in court. At home, though home had become a slippery word by then, the penthouse staff had received instructions from property counsel, polite instructions, devastating instructions, inventory review, restricted removals, temporary occupancy only. The same marble foyer from which Seraphina had once departed with one supervised suitcase now held Adrian standing alone with a legal notice in his hand, understanding at last what architecture feels like when it turns against you. Evelyn collapsed socially before she collapsed emotionally. The women who once leaned close at galas to collect her approval suddenly became impossible to reach. Luncheon invitations cooled. Committee seats shifted. One museum trustee, with almost artistic cruelty, informed her that the family name is under evaluation. Old money does not scream when it excludes you. It simply edits you out of the room. Victor Holden's fall was quieter, but in certain circles, it was just as brutal. The bar opened an inquiry into material misrepresentation and disclosure negligence. His partners, previously delighted by his aggression, became newly fascinated by internal compliance procedures. No one said liability at first. They did not need to. It hovered in the hallways like a scent. Vivian tried to salvage herself the fastest. 3 nights after the hearing, she was photographed leaving a rooftop restaurant with a venture investor 20 years older and substantially richer than Adrian. The photo should have looked glamorous. Instead, it looked desperate. The internet, cruel in its own populist way, named her the evacuation queen. She disabled comments within hours. But Adrian's deepest collapse happened in private, in the mirror, at the edge of sleep, in the moments when noise finally drained away and he had to meet the truth without an audience. Because for the first time in his life, he understood that he had not merely lost money or image. He had misjudged a human being so completely that the error had become a form of self-destruction. Every insult he threw at Saraphina now returned to him sharpened, decorative, empty, invisible. He had been the one decorating a hollow empire. He had been the one empty beneath the polish. And invisibility? That arrived when men stopped returning calls and women stopped looking impressed. Saraphina, meanwhile, did the one thing that made her victory unbearable to them. She remained gracious. Vowel Dominion restructured Mercer Aurum hospitality without mass layoffs. Housekeeping staff kept their jobs. Front desk wages were protected. Vendor contracts designed around Adrian's vanity were cut. Debt was stabilized. The company did not die screaming under tabloids. It was folded, refined, and repurposed under someone who understood stewardship better than image. That hurt him more than destruction would have, because annihilation would have let him play the martyr. Competence left him no costume. When the final order came weeks later, Judge Ward dissolved the marriage, upheld the protected trust structures, and imposed financial penalties tied to false disclosures and abusive litigation posture. Adrian retained enough to remain wealthy by ordinary standards. But ordinary was not the language he had built his soul in. And as he exited the courthouse through a side entrance this time, no mistress, no triumphant mother, no glittering smirk, he heard 2 interns whisper behind him. That's him. The one who mocked her. No title, no awe, no room, just that. And in a life built on being admired, that kind of reduction feels like extinction. 6 months later, rain touched the windows of the Vale Dominion ballroom in soft silver threads, while candles burned low in crystal hurricanes, and a string quartet moved through the air like memory. Saraphina stood at the edge of the stage in deep black silk, her hair falling in one dark wave over one shoulder, emerald eyes calm beneath the chandelier light. Behind her, on a screen framed by white orchids and polished brass, glowed the new name of the restored hospitality group. Not Mercer Aurum, Val Maison, elegant, clean, untouched by noise. The relaunch gala was not loud. True power rarely is. It was filled with ministers, investors, museum chairs, labor advocates, old families, new money, and the staff members Saraphina had insisted be seated in the room rather than hidden behind it. Housekeepers, concierges, junior managers, people Adrian never noticed. When Saraphina stepped to the microphone, the ballroom softened into stillness. There are people, she said, voice low and luminous, who believe silence is proof of weakness. That if a woman is gentle, she must also be helpless. That if she does not announce her power, she does not possess it. She let the room breathe. They are almost always wrong. A ripple of knowing laughter moved through the crowd. I learned something difficult, she continued. Cruel people do not only want to win, they want witnesses. They want your humiliation to echo. But quiet is not emptiness. Quiet can be discipline. Quiet can be memory. Quiet can be a hand steady enough to hold an empire while lesser people laugh.
The applause came slowly at first, then rose warm and full around her. Saraphina smiled, but it was the smile of a woman no longer seeking permission to shine. So let this be the lesson, she said. Never measure a quiet person by the noise around them. Some of the most powerful souls in the world arrive softly, and some of the greatest reversals begin in the exact moment everyone mistakes dignity for defeat. She stepped back from the microphone, then leaned in one final time. And now I want to hear from you. In the comments, tell me this. Which line in the courtroom hit you the hardest? At what moment did you realize Adrian had already lost? And have you ever stayed silent while someone completely underestimated your power? The room rose in a standing ovation. Candles trembled, glass shimmered. Beyond the rain-dark windows, the city glowed like something newly claimed. If this story moved you, Saraphina said, subscribe, like, and share it with someone who needs to remember that quiet does not mean small. She held the room with one last, steady look. Sometimes, she said softly, the softest voice in the room is the one holding the deed.